welcome to Fiction Fans, a podcast where we read books and other words too. I'm Lily.
And I'm Sarah.
And today, you join us on another step on our journey to the center of the Discworld. But before we discuss Carpe Jugulum by Terry Pratchett, Sarah, what's something great that happened recently?
Something great that happened is I'm finally confident that there's not going to be too much snow, at least at the start of our trailhead, or when my father and I go backpacking in a couple of days. This has been a record-breaking year in the Sierras for snow, and I was very concerned that we would be hiking through a lot of snow and it was not going to be any fun and we were going to have to turn back. And some of that may still be true, but I think we are at least going to be able to start our backpacking trip at any rate.
Normally, I would quibble that it's supposed to be a good thing that happened recently, not something you're looking forward to. But I understand the stress of planning an excursion like this, so I'll give it to you.
Finding out that this trip will probably still be able to happen is a good thing.
There you go. All right.
That is separate from the trip happening, because the trip happening will probably, trail conditions allowing, be my good thing next time we record.
All right. The arbiter of good things has decided you're in the clear.
Oh, phew.
You're welcome. Yeah.
What's your good thing?
I also did some outside adventures recently. Daniel and I went to Chelan, which, for Sarah's context, and anyone who knows Northern California, you know how everyone knows someone who has a place or is currently vacationing in Lake Tahoe? Yeah.
That's Chelan. Okay.
It's a little over 3 hours away from Seattle. Not too bad of a drive. We didn't go on a holiday weekend, so that helped. Gorgeous. I've never been much of a lake person. I've always lived near the beach. But it was very nice. Yeah, we did some paddleboarding, some jet skiing. That was kind of the whole point. I was like, let's go do dumb shit on the water.
It sounded like a delightful trip, and the pictures you sent were just lovely.
Oh, it was gorgeous. We did play a lot of board games on our hotel balcony, so it was just board games with a view, but that's fine.
I mean, what else are you going to do with your hotel balcony?
It's true. Yeah. Yeah. And we did like one thing on the lake each day, so it counts.
Yeah. Like, honestly, my feeling is that a vacation is just as much sitting and enjoying the view as it is going out and doing things in that view.
I agree. If I had driven all the way out there and not actually gotten in the water, that would have been silly, though.
Well, yes. But I mean, that's why I say it's just as much.
Yes. Fair. We also did some fun wine. It was great.
I'm glad you had a good time.
Thank you. Didn't do any reading, although that's skipping ahead. Spoiler alert.
Yeah, but I know that at least for me, I always have grand plans of reading when I'm on vacation, and it never happens.
It happens for me occasionally, but like I said, my sitting around in the room time was spent playing board games, specifically the Lord of the Rings board game, which is very good if anyone is interested. It's kind of like a D&D campaign, but with an app that like does the dungeon mastering for you. It's very well done and very fun. So we did a lot of that and no reading.
What a concept, being social with your husband on your vacation.
Gross. Well, Sarah, what are you drinking this evening?
I should have been thematic and chosen wine or tea, but I didn't want to open a bottle when I'm going off tomorrow for backpacking. And I didn't feel like drinking tea because I've had tea all day. So I'm drinking cider. That's a very long-winded way of saying I'm drinking cider.
Yeah, you fucked up a little.
I did.
That's the wrong answer. There's not usually a wrong answer, but it turns out today there is. Yeah, I should have opened a bottle of wine on Monday so that I would have had wine to drink today. I did not think that far ahead because I read this book for last week when we were supposed to record, and then didn't think about actually the contents of it until about 20 minutes before we were getting on this call. Well, I don't know about our listeners, but I forgive you.
Good. I'm glad that we can continue to do a podcast together because you forgive me for my astonishingly bad choice of drink for this episode.
Because I am drinking red wine. Because what else can you drink when you read a vampire book?
It's true. Although tea would have been an acceptable answer because of this particular book.
That's true. But we can't talk about that yet, can we?
Not yet.
Before we talk about the actual book we're going to talk about, have you read anything good lately?
Mostly the dialogue in Dark Alliance 2, which I discovered has been released or ported over to the PS4 and 5, actually. You can buy a version for the PlayStation 5 too. And this happened sometime last year. I'm way behind. I didn't discover that until like 5 days ago. But that's all I've been doing since then.
I'm very happy for you, but you know that doesn't count, right?
I do know it doesn't count.
Good game.
Such a good game. Like, I was thrilled. I was ecstatic when I discovered that the first game had come out.
Nice try.
Yeah, I'm really gunning for it.
Oh my God, do you think there are novelizations? It's in the Forgotten Realms.
I don't know if there are novelizations about these characters specifically. I mean, obviously there's lots of books about Drizzt and Artemis and Trary.
Yeah, but that's not the plot that's happening in the games.
It's not the plot that's happening in the games, it's true.
We really got to do some Forgotten Realms novelizations at some point.
We do, because playing this game really makes me remember how much I enjoyed reading the Drizzt, but it's been years and years and years and years and years, and I have no idea if they hold up at all. I'll probably enjoy reading them still.
At least you'll have that nostalgia factor, right?
Yeah. I do keep thinking, oh man, I want to read these books when I'm playing, though.
Well, I'm not going to lie and pretend that listening to scene-setting description for a board game counts as reading. So no, I have not read anything lately.
I wasn't pretending that it counted as book reading. The question was a more general, have you read anything lately? And yes, I have read dialogue tags on my TV screen.
Fair enough. I guess the definition of our podcast is "and other words too."
That's true.
All right.
Don't reading shame me.
Judgment retracted. Well, I did read Carpe Jugulum by Terry Pratchett, an excellent book in the Witches series of Discworld.
I know. Okay. I know I said this for Witches Abroad, too, but I think actually Carpe Jugulum is my favorite Witches book.
I respect that because it's obviously the best one.
Yeah.
I think I really like Agnes, and this book actually lets her shine in a way that Masquerade did not. I mean, she was the main character of Masquerade, but there was a lot of bullshit that made it hard to enjoy.
Was she really the main character of Masquerade? She's central to like the action of Masquerade, but I think Granny and Nanny are actually the main characters because they're the ones who do all of it.
Okay, we're getting into a conversation of point of view character versus protagonist, which is a fair conversation.
It is irrelevant, and I agree with your point that this book lets her shine more.
Yeah. I would say in Masquerade, she was, I mean, it's third person, but it still clearly is following her story, even though she's not the one causing things to happen, which would give the protagonist label to Nanny and Granny.
Yeah.
In this book, I think the point of view follows her less probably about the same.
I'd say about the same.
Yeah. But she's much more central to shit getting done.
Yes. It feels like she actually does stuff in this book instead of mostly just exists.
And although she does remain a fat person, I feel like a lot less of her character revolves around getting called fat.
Also, yes.
I think Pratchett finally hit the hey, this is a diverse body type. No, every scene with her does not have to be a fat joke. There's still a couple, but it was much easier to swallow.
Yeah, she feels a lot less like a caricature and more like a person.
I feel like it was mostly the bad guys making those jokes in this book.
There's a lot. So as you might have guessed from the title, there are vampires in this book, and they talk a lot about her body type.
And we know vampires are shallow bitches. So that tracks.
Yes. And specifically it is Lacrimosa, who is essentially the vampire teenage daughter of the Count and Countess Magpie. And everyone knows that teenage girls are kind of the worst. So that also tracks.
Agnes also gets in some counter body shaming because she's like, oh, this skinny bitch.
Yeah.
And it's true. Lacrimonious is a skinny bitch, but also she's skinny because she's a bitch. She's not a bitch because she's skinny. I'm trying to make a Mean Girls reference, which is lost on you, but I'm not wrong.
It is lost on me.
So we had some really excellent, like, I'm going to call them alternative vampires, even though that phrase has been ruined by more recent books than this.
Yeah, we don't see a lot of the alternative vampires, but we hear about them a little bit. And essentially, so the vampires in this book are kind of like the quintessential well, I don't even want to call them the quintessential vampire because they lean heavily into learning to avoid stereotypes like eating garlic and being out in sunlight and things like that.
But I think it's very important that our world, stereotypical vampires, is the Discworld traditional stereotypical vampire.
Yes.
Right? Like the Count is actively pushing against this version of vampire that we as readers are very familiar with.
Yeah, and he wants to bring his family into the modern age, but still be blood-sucking, essentially. But there's this kind of vampire counterculture that we hear a little bit about where the vampires, and it's mostly the young ones, the teenage equivalents, go, I would say, anti-goth. Like they stop wearing eyeliner. Their names are, weird things like hieroglyphica, but they decide they want to go by Wendy or Pam or Christopher. And it was a little tidbit and we don't see much of it, but I love that. And I know in later books we see vampires who refuse to drink blood, but I don't think that we get vampires who, and I could be wrong about this because it's been a long time since I've read some of the older Discworld books, but I don't think we get these kind of anti-goth vampires again.
No, I'm remembering the journalist who we end up seeing in like Going Postal.
Well, there's Otto Treek, the cameraman for
I think who I'm thinking of.
Paper, who we meet in The Truth, and who I think also shows up momentarily in Going Postal.
But while he has adapted to mainstream society, is still full goth, shall we say.
Yes. I think he's part of the League of Temperance.
Yeah.
Where they don't drink blood, but they still have the cape and the goth appearance. And every time his light goes off, the camera flash goes off, it disintegrates him.
And he has a little vial of blood necklace that smashes when he hits the ground and it reconstitutes him. He's very good.
He is very good.
Especially when you look at him in contrast with Lacrimonious?
I think it's Lacrimosa.
Lacrimosa, whatever her name is. Lackey. Who is pushing back against the aesthetic, but is also the most bloodthirsty of all of them. She's all into the torture and the murdering and the blood drinking. She just wants to do it with like
being called Pam.
Yeah. Which I had to look up. True Blood, the first True Blood book came out after this book by one whole year. But vampires named Pam, I got a soft spot for them. What can I say?
Very fair. I'm trying to find her name, and I opened to a page earlier with it, and now her name is erased from this book. Her character is just not here. I do think that Vlad calls her Lacey at one point.
Her father and her older brother Vlad both call her Lacci, which that was actually technically how she was introduced. And at first I thought it was Lacci, because Italian. The CC is the ch sound, I think. And then we find out her name is Lacrimona something. And then I thought it was maybe Lackey, but that's a terrible nickname. I don't blame her for being mad about it.
I think that's why I've always just mentally ignored spelling and pronounced it Lacey, which you're right, doesn't make any sense when you go by what her name actually is.
And the double C's change that. Like, nothing about that is Lacey.
No, it's not. But that's still what I'm going to call her.
It is better.
Because it's better. Yeah, Lacrimosa. I finally found her.
She's great. I have a soft spot for vampires. Who doesn't? I mean, okay, I also went through the I'm too cool for vampires phase, but that was definitely trying too hard, and we all know that.
I do remember that phase of yours, though.
I got over it.
Another thing I really like about Terry Pratchett's vampires, especially in this book, is that Agnes makes a direct comparison between vampirism and multi-level marketing or a pyramid scheme, because every person that the vampires turn is subservient to the person who turned them, and then they all go out and turn people.
I mean, it works very well if you think of vampirism as a metaphor for capitalism and pyramid schemes as being the like dark side, worst version of capitalism that can happen.
Yeah, it's a great comparison.
It all fits very well together.
It's almost like Terry Pratchett was really good at writing satire.
Okay, I'm not arguing with that. I do have a follow-up that's in the spoiler section, so we'll talk about that later. But we're talking about vampires right now, and you cannot have vampires without a trash villain. Sarah? I can't believe I'm the one who brought this up.
Do I think that Vlad is a trash villain?
Hear me out.
Okay, I'm listening.
He's the hot son of the Count. Agnes, our main character, is sort of used to being the odd duck. And so having this hot foreigner swoop in and suddenly pay a ton of attention to her and be really into her and not even trying to use her, just like genuinely being interested in her. I mean, he still sucks. He's still a villain. But there is absolutely that, like, I'm different vibe that is very important with a trash villain, I think.
I'm not sure he's quite competent enough to be a trash villain.
He's more competent than the Count. It's not his fault he's not the one in charge.
He is slightly more competent than the Count, it's true. But I still don't know if he quite, I don't know. I don't mentally classify him as a trash villain, but I can see the argument there.
Well, you as the one who has named the thing gets to define it. But it was not my understanding that a trash villain had to be the one in charge.
No.
They have to have some power, but they don't have to be like the apex guy.
No, they don't have to be like the guy in charge, but they do still have to be competent. And I don't know, I feel like things go wrong too much for their plans.
But I do think that's the Count's fault, not Vlad.
Maybe we just don't see him actually like see a plan to fruition enough.
I mean, the only plan we really see is him trying to seduce Agnes.
And that doesn't work.
Then that's, again, also not his fault. That's just how plots go.
True. I think he could be a trash villain.
I think he's definitely in the genre. He might not be like the perfect example of one, but there is definitely something back in my lizard brain that is like, he's bad for you, but it's great that he likes you.
I think, okay, here's what it is. I think that 16-year-old Sarah would have viewed him as a trash villain for that exact reason. And 33-year-old Sarah is a little less into it. So he's not a trash villain.
That's a little too subjective.
Well, the trash villainhood is subjective.
Yeah, but he's not your trash villain then.
He's not my trash villain, but he could be a trash villain.
Yeah, I think that's the distinction. So in this book, we see Varence, the king of Lancre, which is where all of our favorite witches live, invite vampires from a neighboring country to come to his daughter's naming ceremony. Obviously, the vampires then invade, and everything goes to shit.
I don't know if they really invade so much as just don't leave.
They take over.
They were invited.
They were invited to spend time. They were not invited to be the new rulers. So the fact that they took rulership is invading.
Yeah, but I forget which of the witches makes this point. I think it's one of the witches who makes this point. When you invite a vampire in, you are inviting them to take over.
If you know what you're doing, that's called informed consent, Sarah, which is not what Barents had in this situation.
Well, we can agree there. He did not have informed consent.
And it doesn't count as consent if you didn't actually understand the consequences.
Okay, fair. I will accept that argument.
Yes. Should he have known better? Probably. But he didn't. And that's not his fault.
Barents so desperately wants to be a modern ruler who does what's best for his country.
I have such a soft spot for him.
He's so sweet and so ineffectual.
Like, he wants to improve agriculture, and his subjects are like, why don't you drink more? Which is obviously a parody, a satire, if you will, about, the feudal system in general. But don't we all wish our leaders were like Varents?
Yes.
Even if they're fighting against a system that doesn't work, it would be nice to believe that the people making the rules had our best interest at heart.
And they're good-natured and are trying their best.
Yeah. Wouldn't that be a world?
Well, it's called fantasy for a reason.
There's just something really nice about that. And it's really just fantasy wish fulfillment. That it feels more abstract than wish fulfillment. Vlad is wish fulfillment. Varens is just, there's that noise. Well, during this whole invasion or non-invasion, depending on how you define it.
Takeover. We can call it a takeover. I will agree to takeover. I don't necessarily think it's an invasion, but it's definitely a takeover.
Can we compromise with hostile takeover?
Yes.
Okay, that I'm okay with.
Okay.
So during this hostile takeover, we meet two different henchmen who are both incredible and amazing, and I love them in two very different ways. On the Lanker side, we have Hodgesarg,
who we've seen before in Lords and Ladies, I believe.
A lot of the people in Lanker do feel very familiar. Of course, all of the Og family.
Obviously.
We've met before, yeah. But Hodgesarg is the falcon tamer, the birds keeper for the king, except he kind of is left to his own devices and is just a weird dude who's really into birds. But he has his thing, and he's confident with it, and we see him basically groveling through most of the book because he's like, yeah, I'm in way over my head. I don't know what's going on. You tell me what to do. And then at some point, a matter of birds comes up, and some people of a higher social station are pretending to know things about birds. And he's like, no, this is my thing. I know it. I don't argue with you when you do ruling, but this is bird stuff. This is my thing. That's not, obviously verbatim the dialogue in this book, but I just love how he stands up for himself, but also he trusts the witches and just sort of lets all of the weird bullshit go.
I think the thing that I most appreciate about Hodgesarg, there's a scene kind of in the middle of the book where he and the Omnian priest, whose name I can't remember, are talking. And Hodgesarg is basically like, this is above my pay grade. I don't know what to do about it. I don't know how to deal with it. So I'm just not going to. Like, that's for people who know who are trained to handle this kind of thing to deal with. And I think that we all should be empowered to say that in our working life. That's not always how it goes at work, but I think it should be.
I agree, but think there's a little bit of extra context that's important. The priest is saying, aren't you stressed out that you don't understand what's going on? And Hodgesarg says, no, that's not my job. Which is great. But again, because he knows that the witches are there taking care of it, he's not just like letting it go. He's like, there's someone here whose job it is to do this. I'm not going to fuck with it. And also, he's not, that's not my job. So, like, fuck all y'all, I'm going home.
I mean, he's not unhelpful. No.
Yeah, he still helps. He just doesn't feel the need to be in charge. Whereas the priest, well, there is definitely tension between the priest and traditional, like, organized religion with the witches and their whole deal. And this is sort of a turning point for him in the book. Spoiler, the priest isn't a bad guy. That almost could be a spoiler, but Pratchett's too nice to do that, I think.
Yeah, Pratchett does sometimes have priests as villains, but they're always very well telegraphed.
The priest in this book is an example of, personal growth, shall we say. But yeah, him running into Hodge's guard and them having Hodge's
Arg.
I did one typo and now I can't. Okay, that is a dumb name though, actually. I take that apology back.
Hodge is like, no, it's great because there's a reason for it. Because the Arg is there because that's what he always says, because his birds are always like chewing on him.
No, there's a reason for it. That doesn't make it a real name.
Well, no, it's not a real name. I'm not trying to argue that.
But he's fantastic. He has some excellent moments and lines in this book where he does him. I think that's it. He does him.
He does do him.
You know who else does him? Igor.
I also really like Igor.
Oh, amazing. Fantastic. I think this is the first Igor we've met in Discworld.
I don't think so. There's at least been mention of an Igor before.
In the City Watch?
Maybe I'm thinking about Night Watch, which we have read out of order.
That's kind of what I'm thinking.
Yeah. So it could be actually that.
And at this point, Igor is not introduced as an Igor. He is introduced as Igor, although we get all of the establishment for the species that we see later on.
Yeah, I think maybe it's possible. I'm not going to rule out the possibility of there having been one or two mentions of Igors in previous books, but I think that this is certainly the first book that we've read chronologically that has Igor as like a main character.
I think this is the first Igor because we're really seeing Pratchett sort of explore the concept of, they have all of this. I mean, not even they. I think that's it. At this point, Igor is a dude. And we don't have any hint that there's a race of people called Igors that all have the same name, which is what it evolves into later. And there's some very interesting, like, concept of self because they all, like, borrow parts from each other.
Does he talks about, our Igor talks about his family, though. Does he not give names for any of them?
Exactly. That's why I think this is the first Igor, because while Pratchett is establishing the idea of this group of people who swap body parts and, like, are these crazy science dudes, gender neutral dudes, he has not yet named the species Igor. And I think if that was already a thing, that would have shown up here. Igor would have referred to his uncle as Uncle Igor.
Yeah.
Instead of just my uncle.
Yeah, it's quite possible.
Because all Igors being named Igor is hilarious. And excellent. And the fact that we don't see it here makes me think it hasn't happened yet.
Yeah, I think that's quite possible.
And that's my literary analysis instead of just Googling when the first example of an Igor is in Discworld.
Yeah, I thought about Googling, but that seemed like a lot of work.
Yeah, and I know the answer.
To be honest.
So. But he's amazing for most of the reasons we just went over. But he's introduced as the lackey of the vampires, the underappreciated lackey, because he is very old school. And these vampires are like, why are there cobwebs? And he's like, it's for the ambiance. And they get mad about it. And so there's a lot of tension.
He used to work for the old count, who was a very traditional kind of vampire. And then the old count, at some unspecified point in time, got defeated by someone who was visiting his castle or whatever. And so now he works for the new count, who is not a traditionalist. And there's, like you say, a lot of tension there.
There's a lot of really excellent moments around employees who don't feel appreciated.
Yes.
There's an incredible line. I'm going to butcher it because I didn't actually write it down. But Igor begins getting mysteriously stupider, like all employees who feel like they're not being appreciated. And that's just like the best description of malicious compliance that you could ever get in a fantasy novel.
He does at one point get to throw stuff at the Count and his family. And who hasn't wanted to throw stuff at a bad boss before? The other thing I'd like to mention about this book is that it does have Granny's very famous quote about the nature of sin. So I feel like this is one of the quotes, along with the Vimes Boots theory of economics or of economic inequality, or whatever the title is, about how buying cheap boots is more expensive for poor people than rich people buying nice boots. Granny's quote about the nature of sin, I feel, is one of the most quoted Discworld quotes, and I've said quotes an awful lot now.
Cloth the Sarah, nevermore.
But she says, there's no grays, only white that's got grubby. I'm surprised you don't know that. And sin, young man, is when you treat people as things, including yourself. And then she's talking to the priest, and the priest tries to argue that it's more complicated than that. And Granny's like, no, that's the heart of it.
Okay. So I always thought the whites that got grubby was from Good Omens. I probably just read these at the same time back when I was 14. Because also, this, listeners can't tell, but my book is beat to shit.
Your book has seen some things.
It's seen some things. I don't know how. We need a side-by-side comparison of our two books because it's very funny. They're the same age novel.
Yes. I think my copy is actually a little bit older than yours.
That's even worse.
Yeah. But yes, this quote is very definitely from Carpe Jugulum and not Good Omens.
All right, fair enough.
Good Omens, to be fair, I think Good Omens espouses some of the same themes.
So I do think Pratchett borrows some language from Discworld for Good Omens, but that's not the point. This is not a Good Omens episode. More importantly, I don't love that those two quotes are grouped together because I feel like it undercuts each individual clause. There's no gray, there's just white that's got grubby. Great. Fantastic. But this line that the origin of all sin is treating people like objects, I think kind of gets lost in the shadow of the other one. But that's very powerful.
I see what you're saying.
And I think that's really the main cut of this book.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly agree with you that I think one of the main themes, it has nothing to do with gray being white that's got grubby, but everything to do with treating people as objects and what happens to you when you start doing that.
Yeah. And that I felt like that was so much more thoughtful and impactful, but it's not as soundbitey, right? It's all black and white. Gray is just white that's got grubby. Like, that's very punchy.
I mean, I think that the quote as a whole sounds very good together, but you're right, that final bit does kind of get overshadowed a little bit by the start.
Obviously I've read this book before, but I've never heard that full quote. Like, when quoted, I've never heard the full quote. I've always heard it cut off for just the first part, as far as like in the wild goes. So like, yeah, that is the most quoted one of the most quoted things from Discworld.
I was talking about the quote as a whole, not just that one part.
I've never seen the quote as a whole in the wild.
Okay, I have.
Okay.
Yeah, I have seen the quote as a whole in the wild. I think you're right that we see just that first statement a little more often because it's easier to remember. But I do see the whole quote on I won't say fairly regular basis, but
You have seen it.
I see it often enough to think that as a whole is one of the most quoted things.
Maybe. But I am going to stand by the fact that the second half gets overshadowed by the first half, which is a big shame.
Sure. Like, I won't argue that.
Well, we have some very fun witch talk. We've got some great vampires to deconstruct, but all of that is going to be in the spoiler section. Oh, we normally discuss this beforehand. When should you read this Discworld novel? This was one of my first Discworld books. This is not going to surprise you, but after I finally read a full Discworld book, I was like, vampire one, check that one next.
I do think that you probably benefit from having some witches context before you read this one.
I think this book provides all the context you need. Magrat used to be a witch. Now she's the queen. She's kind of back. That's all you need to know.
I think you can read it without having read anything else. But I do still think that you benefit from knowing the witches a little better than that.
I think if you're into Discworld, you would benefit from it. But if you were like, I don't know, I will maybe read one of these and I love vampires, then yeah, go for it.
Well, yeah, I'm not going to disagree there.
I think there's two different readers, right? There's one who wants to start all of Discworld. Yeah, don't start here. But if you're thinking maybe I'll read one or two Discworld books, you could read this one alone.
If you're on the fence about reading anything Discworld and you like vampires, you should read this one.
Yeah.
If you want to read Discworld more broadly, then you should not start here.
The remainder of this episode contains spoilers. Okay, so I hate to bring it up, but I have to, because this is a vampire story. Did Terry Pratchett call Twilight before Twilight?
Give me your argument for why he did.
Okay, so Vlad, who we have decided is a trash villain, if not your trash villain.
Yes.
Is a hottie McHot vampire who's super into Agnes, and we find out it's because he can't read her mind. And which everyone knows is the origin of the love story between Edward and Bella, because he can read people's minds, but he can't read Bella's, and that makes her mysterious and interesting.
I'll admit, that's a pretty compelling argument, because that is the reason why Vlad is interested in Agnes.
It is nice that he doesn't care that she's fat. He's just like, yeah, I'm into her, I like her, everyone fuck off. It doesn't feel like he's using her. I do think his interest in her is genuine.
I agree. I think his interest in her is genuine.
Which is why that plotline is so... Okay, obviously I'm a romance reader. But that toxic love story where, he's no good for me, but he likes me. There's something there, okay?
I mean, I am definitely not a Vlad Agnes shipper at all. But I do really appreciate that some of the characters, namely Nanny, are just simply in terms of practicality. Nanny's like, we want to get rid of this guy or make him change his way. He's interested in you, Agnes. Either you marry him and stake him, on your wedding night, or you marry him and change him. And I love that.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Especially because Nanny has had so many husbands. So you're like, what have you done?
Yeah, you do end up with a lot of questions about Nanny's life experiences there.
Which I feel like have always been there, but it pulled them to the forefront.
Yes.
I think part of why I get to enjoy Vlad so fully is because Agnes never waffles. She's like, I love the attention, but I fucking hate you. Go die in a fire. And that is perfect. Because then, as the reader, I can go, Yes, this garbage trash villain is into her, and it's amazing. But I don't have to feel bad that the main character like has a crisis or does something stupid.
I do appreciate that she doesn't do anything stupid. And even if she did get together with him, it would be a very practical matter and not because she had suddenly fallen for his charms and was going to forsake all of her morals.
Yeah, like that. I don't know. It hits good. It hits right. Agnes gets shit on a lot, and there's a lot of verbiage in Masquerade, which is the book where she goes and joins the opera, about how like she's just not a love interest because she's fat, and that sucks. And so having a very sexy man be very into her, not trying to use her, just and I mean, yeah, he's a bad guy, but he is actually just very into her. It's nice.
His villainhood is completely separate from his interest in her.
Yes.
But yeah, I agree that I like as a plot point that he's into her and that just really the only factor is he finds her interesting. There's nothing else there. There's no ulterior motive.
Yeah. And also when I've already forgotten Lacrimonious's name.
Lacrimosa.
Lacrimosa? Like a mimosa.
Yes.
But not quite. All right. Maybe I'll remember now.
I'm not holding my breath.
So she's a rude, skinny bitch who is like, why are you even into that tub of lard? And Vlad never says, nah, he just says, fuck off. And there's something about that not getting defensive over it that we haven't seen for Agnes before.
Yeah.
I feel like there have been some like lame fat jokes for her.
Yeah.
And there are still quite a few like, oh, you really like chocolate jokes in this book, which gets very old after like the third one.
And to be fair, Lacrimosa's remarks do feel like she's taking anything to needle her older brother rather than being necessarily personally directed at Agnes, if that makes sense. I mean, they're still rude and uncalled for.
Oh yeah, but she was just like, I'm gonna be rude.
Yeah.
That's her whole thing, is that like, yeah, I torture people to death and I'm really rude. So it totally fits. It's fine.
Yeah.
Clearly I read this book when I was about 14, is all I'm gonna say.
I mean, 14-year-old me felt much the same way about Vlad as 14-year-old Lily did.
Mm-hmm. I just imprinted on it. And this is one of the Discworld books that I have reread the most, just because I had bought it and then it was a book I owned, and I cannot overstate how many times I reread books in high school.
Yeah, that's fair.
Now I have disposable income. The world is my oyster. And I know you're like, Lily, libraries exist, and I'm like, yeah, but back then I had to go to one, and they weren't in malls, so
I feel like it was much easier to just go and buy a book than rent it from the library quite often.
Well, in that era, I remember I would hang out with friends. We would go to an ice cream store of some kind because I was a child. We might walk around a clothing store and laugh at slutty clothes because I was a horrible 14-year-old, and then probably go to a bookstore. Like, that was just what I did. There were no ice cream stores near libraries, and that is a design flaw.
Clearly, there should be an ice cream store in every library.
Honestly, the fact that Barnes & Noble put Starbucks in them revolutionized my young life.
Except that Barnes & Noble has taken out a lot of their, not the chairs in the cafe area, but like at least my Barnes & Noble used to have seating just within the stacks, if they're still called stacks in a bookstore, I don't know, shelves. And they took out all of that, which was a bad decision, in my opinion.
I agree. I mean, we're talking about over a decade ago right now, so
yes.
at the time they still had seating. But I also do remember just sitting there and reading an entire comic book, so I get why they didn't want that to happen anymore.
I mean, fair. I did the same thing too. I actually remember doing that at a local bookstore that was near my stepfather's store where I would go after school. And I feel really bad for that place because they had to deal with like 10-year-old Sarah going in and reading their books and maybe spending $5 on a book, like on a rare occasion. But in my defense, I was 10. But it's a fine way to read books.
Yeah, it got me here. We're doing okay.
We're doing okay. We have gotten very distracted from talking about Carpe Jugulum, though.
Oh, I mean, but all of this is part of it. This book is so much embedded in my like youth.
Yeah, it's hard to separate books out from that kind of feeling that you have for them, emotional connection.
There are some books where rereading them really does transport you to the first time you read them. And I know that's such a like oversaid thing. But it's true.
And this is one of those for you?
This is one of those for me. Not a lot of Discworld books are, I think because there are so many of them. That like when I was in a place where I could read like I could go get 4 and then read a bunch, then it just all sort of melded together.
Mm-hmm.
But when I had a finite amount of pocket money, then I could buy one Terry Pratchett book and then just like reread that for 3 months until I could buy another book. Again, I couldn't drive. How was I supposed to get to the library?
That's true.
That's unfair. If I had asked, my parents would have taken me to the library. That just wasn't on my radar. I was a kid.
My father's house is literally half a block away from the library. So it was pretty easy for me to get there.
Nice.
I still didn't spend as much time there as I probably should have.
This book is about vampires, and therefore it is also about death. Not the fun death, who we love, who's the Grim Reaper made out of bones, but like the concept.
I mean, death as a character does show up, but we do have a lot, or this book deals a lot with making hard decisions that involve who is going to die, not in a like a cruel way, but in just an ordinary little like Granny can only save one person. Is she going to save the mother or the newborn? Like that kind of hard decision.
There's also conversations around euthanasia. Their family brings her in to help someone who is suffering greatly on the edge of death. And we get Granny's internal monologue about how she doesn't kill them. She just shows them how to let go, which is fascinating when you think about statistics of people in end-of-life care. How after they see their whole family, they're just like, yeah, I'm done. It just happens naturally.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting given how Terry Pratchett went. I mean, he didn't end up dying by assisted suicide, but he certainly wanted the right to do so.
And this was much before that, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, this is years and years and years and years and years before his diagnosis.
It's fascinating that we already see that, like, you know, people deserve to end their life with dignity before it's personal.
Yeah, I think that it's really interesting to look at this book and that aspect of this book with the knowledge that he wrote this long before anything happened to him and still see like that viewpoint reflected. Not that it's necessarily a surprise, I suppose, but I just think it's interesting.
Yeah, there is that element of personal choice that's so important.
Mm-hmm. And like making a judgment call. Granny has another good quote about how being human is all about judging, which is not a sexy way of looking at it, you know. But I think it's true. We're all always making judgment calls.
Well, I think that's a very dramatic way of just saying decisions.
Yeah.
It sounds much more important when you call it a judgment. When really she's just like, yeah, I decided.
But especially in what she's doing, I think there is an aspect of judgment. I mean, not judging a person.
Using your best judgment.
Using your best judgment, yeah.
Yeah, of course. Which you should be doing for every decision that you make. I say like a hypocrite. Yeah, and the idea that people bring Granny in when they don't want to make the decision, and then they get to blame her no matter what the decision is.
Mm-hmm.
It's a it's a social responsibility that she is dealing with that the book kind of touches on it a little bit. People call Nanny for births and Granny for deaths.
Mm-hmm.
It's sobering. This for all of the sexy vampires, this book is very sad.
This book definitely has a darker cast than some of the more lighthearted Discworld books, because you kind of get the sense that what Granny does weighs very heavily on her. Like, it's not an easy job.
But also it has to. If it didn't weigh heavily on her, that would be horrifying.
Well, and that's kind of the whole point, right? Like, yes, it's hard, and yes, it's hard on her, but she would be a monster if it wasn't.
It's that idea that the hard road is sometimes the right road.
Treating people as things.
Well, yes.
And not treating people as things.
Yeah, even though she is making the decision between life and death, she is always considerate and respectful.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the vampires, the newfangled vampires, even if they aren't killing people, they're taking away their free will in a way that is antithesis to our idea of humanity.
Yes.
I guess you could say killing someone or allowing someone to die on their own terms is also making the decision between life and death, but it's such a different because this is a fantasy novel, we're able to have Granny like mind meld with these people. And so we can believe her when she says they wanted it, I just showed them the way.
Well, I also think that sometimes she just makes a judgment call without necessarily having any kind of contact with the person, mental or otherwise, because she has the experience. Like, she's not just doing this callously. She knows what someone can come back from and what someone can't. And she knows what the compassionate option is, even if it's not the option that the family would necessarily want.
Well, there's no way to make a rational decision when you're that close. And that's why these families are calling her in.
Yeah.
And part of them knows that. And so the fact that they then blame her afterwards is extra bullshit, which is the point.
I mean, it is human nature, though, to lash out.
Oh, yeah. You got to blame somebody.
Yeah. But it is bullshit.
This is a very good book for Granny.
It's a good Granny book.
And you complimented Nanny. This is clearly the best witches book.
I do like Nanny. It's not that I dislike Nanny.
Yeah, but you complimented her unprompted from me.
Okay.
Which is still exceptional.
I feel like I've complimented Nanny before.
Probably.
I'm not going to go back and listen to all of our witches episodes to prove it, but...
So, you know that I like Terry Pratchett, right?
I think it's obvious by now, yes.
I'm amongst friends. I can say this and be taken, at face value, and not that I'm being a huge jerk. He does do the Pratchett monologue.
He does do the Pratchett. I mean, I love the Pratchett monologue, but he does do it.
Well, I always agree with it. So you're sitting there reading, going, yeah. And then a page later, you're like, wow, you just kind of said it, huh? It's always not always a different character, but it's whoever the triumphant character is in the moment saying something, very observant and pithy about human nature. And it's related to the plot of the book. It's quote unquote in context, but it's also clearly about people in our world. And it's you gotta go through some monologues. He doesn't let it sit.
It's a trademark of the Discworld books.
I feel like this is the first one that I've been like, all right. They've definitely happened before.
I mean, they've definitely happened before. I like all of them, so I don't necessarily, like, I didn't feel what I think you're describing for this particular book.
I think it stood out for me in this book because it's one that I'm more familiar with. So in a book that you're reading for the first time, or at least the first time in memory, you get to the Pratchett monologue and you're like, hey, these are the things that I've been piecing together. Yeah, I agree with this. Whereas for this book, it's like, yeah, I read the book. I know. But I do think that's just because I've read it more often.
I can't recall feeling like that about any of the Discworld books that I reread on a regular basis, specifically Night Watch, which I reread every year, or have ever since he passed away. And I'm sure that there's a Pratchett monologue in that book.
They're usually so touching that it's fine. And in this one, it's touching. It's just that I have reached saturation point.
Yeah, I think that's not an everyone thing.
It's not necessarily a problem, but that is definitely a criticism of his books, that he's too on the nose. And I think if he took out the monologue, he wouldn't be that on the nose.
I don't know. I mean, yes, he would maybe be less on the nose, but I think that the monologues are some of the more poignant moments in the book, or more striking moments in the book. And I don't think the book would be as strong without that kind of like conclusive bit.
Okay. It's very enjoyable. There has to be something in the back of your head going, am I just in an echo chamber reading books that I agree with because I agree with them, and never hearing something different?
Not with Discworld.
All right, fair enough.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think I wonder that about my reading as a whole, maybe sometimes, but not about a specific book, because when I read Discworld, I'm not going into it looking for something that will challenge my worldview necessarily. Like, I know what I'm going to get in a Discworld book.
I didn't mean to raise this as a problem, just like a
just an observation.
Yeah, it really feels nice being agreed with. And is that okay?
Yes, I think that's okay.
No, I should always be mad. If I'm not mad, that means something is wrong.
I think society tells us that we have to be mad all the time, and I disagree with that. I think it's perfectly fine to enjoy something, to read a book that you agree with, to not have something to argue over.
Does that make me small-minded, though?
No, because if all you read was like that, but like, you do read outside things and things that you don't like, and you're not just focusing on one very small sliver.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
We should have had that conversation before I read this book, and then I wouldn't have gone into a tailspin during the triumphant moment at the end.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of Fiction Fans.
Come disagree with us. We're on Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok at FictionFansPod. You can also email us at fictionfanspod@gmail.com.
If you enjoyed the episode, please rate and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts, and follow us wherever your podcasts live.
We also have a Patreon where you can support us and find our show notes and a little bit of other nonsense.
Thanks again for listening, and may your villains always be defeated. Bye.
Bye.